To everyone else, Officer Daniel Cross was untouchable. The crisp uniform, the gleaming badge, the perfect posture. He was the textbook image of law and order. At community meetings, folks called him a hero. At precinct gatherings, they raised a glass to Cross, the Rock. And on the streets, his name carried weight. Too much weight. But what no one knew, not his colleagues, not his wife, not even the man in the mirror, was that the badge wasn't just a symbol of service to him. It was armor, a shield, not from bullets but from shame, from the truth. He hadn't always been this way. Growing up in a household where silence was louder than screams, Daniel learned early how to bury things. His father, a war vet turned drunk, taught him one rule: don't show weakness, ever. So he didn't. Not when his mother walked out. Not when his brother OD'd. Not even when he buried them both by 26. Joining the force felt like a calling. Or maybe it was just an escape. Either way, he found power in the badge. Authority gave him control. Control gave him safety. And safety, well, that was something he hadn't felt since he was 10. Still, power has a way of corrupting the wounded. And Daniel, though brave, though loyal, was deeply, devastatingly wounded. He started crossing lines. Not all at once. First, it was small. Bending rules during arrests, justifying force with phrases like "he resisted" or "she was non-compliant." Then came the cover-ups, the intimidation tactics, the threats veiled as warnings. And then one night he met her, Naomi Reyes, a public defender with fire in her gut and justice in her bones. They were on opposite sides of a case. A kid, barely 18, accused of assaulting an officer. Daniel's statement was damning. Naomi's client swore he was innocent. She smelled something off from the start, but couldn't put her finger on it. Not yet. What she didn't know was that Daniel had snapped that night. He was 2 years into a divorce, his career was on the rocks, and he'd just been passed over for promotion again. The kid had mouthed off, nothing serious, just teenage arrogance. But Daniel's rage boiled over. He made the arrest violent. Then he made up the report. He didn't expect Naomi to dig. He didn't expect her to care. But she did. And she would be the one to peel back the layers of his armor, piece by piece, until all that remained was the man beneath it. Naked, ashamed, and utterly exposed. Naomi had seen plenty of shady reports. Came with the territory. But something about this one lingered in her mind like a splinter she couldn't shake. The language in Officer Cross's report felt too polished, too rehearsed. There was a rhythm to it, a familiarity. As if it wasn't the first time he'd written something like this. She stared at the file for hours, highlighted every phrase that felt too convenient, compared it to past cases. That's when she noticed a pattern. Cross's name had come up more often than coincidence allowed. Excessive force claims, dismissed charges, youths with no records suddenly becoming violent suspects overnight. The deeper she dug, the more uncomfortable she felt. Not because she feared what she'd find, but because she knew exactly what she was walking into. She wasn't naive. A badge gave some men more than authority. It gave them permission. So she started knocking on doors. Former defendants, witnesses, families who'd been silenced by fear or buried under bureaucracy. Most were hesitant to talk. Some outright refused. But there were a few, quiet voices ready to speak now that someone was finally listening. One of them was Malik Johnson. He was 23 now, but the shadows under his eyes made him look older. When Naomi met him at a diner downtown, he kept looking over his shoulder like Cross was going to walk in any second. After a few minutes of guarded small talk, he finally leaned in. "He broke my wrist," Malik said, voice barely above a whisper. "Said I tried to run. I didn't. I froze. But he threw me down anyway. Then he told me if I filed a complaint, he'd say I had a knife. I was 16. I believed him." Naomi's stomach turned. Not because she was shocked, but because she wasn't. Back at her office, she pinned every name, every date, every report to a growing wall of evidence. It was like unraveling a sweater. One tug, and the whole thing came undone. She knew the courtroom would be a war zone. Cross had allies, a stellar record, polished demeanor that charmed juries. And the case? A teenager with no power against a veteran officer. The odds were trash. But Naomi had something Daniel didn't. The truth. And the truth has a funny way of surviving, even when it's buried under years of lies. Daniel could feel the pressure closing in, though he wouldn't admit it out loud. There was a new tension in the air, like static before a storm. He'd seen Naomi in courtrooms before. Tenacious, smart, annoyingly persuasive. But this time, she had a different look in her eye, like she already knew something he didn't want her to find. He told himself she had nothing. She was grasping at straws. Just another idealist trying to make a name for herself by tearing down a cop. But the doubt still itched at the back of his mind. He met with internal affairs behind closed doors. They asked about the report, his record, and the arrest. He gave them the usual script, cool and confident. But one of them, a younger guy new to the department, kept staring like he wasn't buying it. Meanwhile, Naomi filed for discovery on 5 of Cross's past cases. She didn't just want to win. She wanted to expose him, piece by piece. But it wasn't just about Daniel anymore. The deeper she dug, the more she uncovered a culture, a system that let men like him thrive. Officers covering for each other, complaints disappearing, judges turning blind eyes. It was bigger than him, and that terrified her. She started getting anonymous calls, blocked numbers, heavy breathing, then silence. One night, her car alarm went off at 3 a.m. Nothing was stolen, but the message was clear. Stop. Daniel didn't have to say it, but Naomi knew. This was his way of reminding her who held the power. But she wouldn't back down. Not now. She doubled her efforts, interviewed more victims, dug through archives, talked to ex-officers. Some were too scared. But one, Officer Lana Trent, recently retired, agreed to speak. I saw what he did to that kid, Lana whispered. But I was warned. Keep quiet or lose my pension. Naomi recorded every word. In the courtroom, Daniel walked with swagger. The badge still on his chest, the smirk still on his lips. But Naomi saw it now. The cracks, the tiny, invisible fractures in his armor. And she was ready to drive a wedge through every single one of them. The courtroom was cold. Not just from the air conditioning, but from the way eyes darted across the room, calculating, judging. Naomi walked in with a thick binder clutched to her chest like a weapon. Behind her trailed her client, young, nervous, and visibly shaking. He looked like a lamb walking into a slaughterhouse. On the other side sat Daniel, back straight, eyes steady, wearing the same badge that had become both sword and shield. But his jaw clenched a little tighter this time. The judge entered, gavel pounded, and the trial began. Naomi wasted no time. Her opening statement wasn't flashy, it was surgical. Calm, precise, brutal. She told the jury they wouldn't just hear about one bad arrest. They'd see a pattern. They'd see what power looked like when it went unchecked. Daniel's lawyer scoffed, called it a witch hunt, claimed Naomi was grandstanding, chasing shadows. But the courtroom didn't shift back to him the way it used to. Not this time. Witness after witness took the stand. Some shaky, some defiant. But all with stories that echoed each other. Sudden force, missing body cam footage, charges that made no sense. Then came Lana Trent. The room held its breath as the retired officer stepped forward. Her voice cracked, but she didn't waver. She described what she'd seen. The threats, the silence, the fear. And then, with a glance at Daniel, she said the words that silenced even his attorney. We weren't protecting the public anymore. We were protecting ourselves. Daniel shifted in his seat. It was subtle, but Naomi saw it. A twitch, a flicker of fear. His armor, forged in years of control, was denting. And for the first time since the trial began, Naomi allowed herself to believe he could actually lose. The day Naomi called her client to the stand, you could have heard a pin drop. The kid, Jameer Thomas, had never spoken in a courtroom before. Never even been inside one before this nightmare began. His hands shook, his voice cracked, but his eyes, those held fire. Naomi stood beside him, her tone gentle but firm. Jameer, tell the jury what happened that night. And he did. Not all at once. Came in pieces like shards of glass too sharp to handle. He told them about walking home after a friend's party. About the flashing lights. About the voice that barked orders he didn't understand. About how he raised his hands and still got slammed into the hood of the car. He described the sound of his cheekbone cracking, the blood in his mouth, the cold metal of the cuffs. And most of all, he described the eyes of the officer who did it. He didn't look angry, Jameer said. He looked empty, like I wasn't even a person, just something he had to break. Daniel stared at the floor. The prosecution objected, tried to rattle Jameer, but the jury was already leaning in. They weren't hearing a defendant anymore. They were hearing a child chewed up and spit out by a system that never saw him. Later that afternoon, Naomi presented a series of internal memos and complaints, each one tied to Daniel, each one buried or dismissed. The timeline painted a brutal picture. Then came the footage. It was grainy, shaky, recorded from a bedroom window by someone too scared to come forward until Naomi found them. But it was enough. You couldn't see everything, but you could see enough. A body thrown to the ground. A fist where there should have been a handcuff. The figure, Daniel's figure, stepping back like nothing happened. Gasps filled the courtroom. Daniel's attorney asked for a recess. The judge granted it. But the damage was done. Naomi walked past Daniel on her way out. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to, because for the first time in his career, Daniel Cross didn't look like a protector. He looked like a man cornered by his own shadow. By the time the court reconvened the next morning, the silence in the room wasn't just tension. It was reckoning. The air carried the weight of truth finally spoken aloud. Naomi sat still at the plaintiff's table, her fingers resting on a closed folder. Her eyes didn't leave Daniel. Daniel Cross, once untouchable, now felt the familiar grip of fear. Not the quick, sharp kind, but the slow, gnawing type that creeps in at night when no one's watching. He wasn't afraid of prison. He wasn't even afraid of the public. He was afraid of losing the thing he had built his identity around: control. When Naomi rose for closing arguments, she took her time. No theatrics, no shouting, just quiet, powerful truth. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began. "A badge is not supposed to make a man a god. It's not supposed to protect the ones who abuse it. It's meant to serve and protect us all, equally, fairly. But when it becomes armor for the broken, it no longer protects the people. It protects the lie." She pointed to Jameer. This young man could have died that night, and the system would have swept it away, because Officer Cross wrote the report, because his word was law. But that law is only as good as the people who carry it. She let the silence hang. Ask yourself, if he hadn't been caught, how many more Jameers would there be? Daniel's lawyer countered, of course, called the footage inconclusive, called the testimony emotional, said Naomi built her case on feelings, not facts. But the jury looked tired, not from the trial, but from the truth they could no longer unsee. The deliberation took longer than Naomi expected. Hours passed. She sat in a bench outside the courtroom, watching the light change through the windows. Daniel paced across the lobby, his lawyer murmuring strategies and appeals in his ear. But Daniel barely heard him. He was back in his mind, back to that night, back to the sound of Jameer's head hitting the hood, back to the silence in his car afterward. He'd told himself it was justified, told himself the kid was lucky he wasn't worse off. But the truth was, Daniel had stopped seeing people. He only saw threats, challenges, mouths to silence. When the jury returned, every footstep echoed. The foreperson handed the note to the bailiff. The judge read it quietly, then aloud. "We find the defendant, Officer Daniel Cross, guilty." The words hit like a slow explosion. Jameer let out a shaky breath. Naomi closed her eyes. Daniel didn't move. For the first time, he felt the badge not as armor but as weight, as shame, as consequence. And though the courtroom didn't erupt, the silence was louder than any cheer could have been. Because justice, when it arrives late, doesn't come with celebration. comes with release. Naomi gathered her things quietly. No fist pump. No victory dance. Just a quiet exit through the side door. Outside, the sky had shifted. Rain clouds gathered above. And Daniel Cross, once a symbol of authority, now stood alone. Unarmed. Unmasked. The verdict had fallen like a hammer. And with it, the fragile illusion that had shielded Daniel Cross began to crumble. Outside the courtroom, the chatter was low, almost reverent, as if everyone felt the weight of what had just transpired. For Daniel, the world had shifted beneath his feet. The badge he once wore like armor now felt like chains dragging him down into a pit he couldn't escape. He wasn't a villain, at least not in the simple way people might think. No, Daniel was a man shaped by scars no one else could see. The silence of his childhood home, the harsh lessons from a father who taught him strength meant never showing pain, the slow erosion of empathy as years on the force piled on layer after layer of cynicism. He'd buried the boy he once was under that uniform and those badges, hiding behind power because feeling vulnerable was a luxury he couldn't afford. But now, exposed and vulnerable, stripped of his armor by a woman who refused to look away, Daniel was forced to confront a truth that had been gnawing at him from the inside all along. His choices, his actions, they hadn't protected anyone. They'd hurt people. Real people with names and stories and futures. Naomi watched him from across the room, her expression unreadable. She wasn't celebrating. This wasn't about victory for her. It was about justice, a word that carried heavy meaning in a world too often blind to pain beneath the surface. She'd torn down a wall built on fear and lies, but she knew the fight wasn't over. The system that protected men like Daniel was still intact, and the scars it left on the community ran deep. Speaking openly about accountability, justice, and the humanity behind the headlines. One evening, after a particularly charged discussion on police reform, Daniel stayed behind to talk with a young man named Marcus, a kid who reminded him painfully of Jameer. Marcus shared his fears and frustrations about growing up in a neighborhood shadowed by mistrust. Daniel listened, truly listened, for the first time in years. That moment, small but profound, was a turning point. Back at home, Daniel penned a journal, a habit Naomi had encouraged. Writing helped him face his darkest thoughts, chart his progress, and hold himself accountable. He reflected on the badge he'd once worn as armor and realized it had been both his shield and his prison. Now, without it, he was free to feel everything he'd long suppressed. The road ahead was uncertain. There would be setbacks, doubts, and the ever-present weight of his past. But Daniel no longer hid behind armor. Instead, he chose to walk openly through the ashes of his former life, seeking redemption not as a destination but as a daily practice. As dawn broke over the city skyline, Daniel stepped outside, breath visible in the crisp morning air. The badge was gone, but a new resolve burned within him. A promise to protect, not with force, but with honesty, empathy, and courage. Time, Daniel learned, was both a healer and a teacher. The wounds left by his past actions weren't going to vanish with a simple apology or a courtroom verdict. They demanded patience, understanding, and relentless work, not only from him, but from the community that bore the scars of his mistakes. It was a hard lesson, but one he embraced with a quiet determination. Daniel's days began to blend into a rhythm of accountability. He attended support groups for former officers grappling with similar battles, sharing stories that had long been buried beneath layers of pride and denial. These meetings weren't easy. Opening up felt like stripping away the last pieces of armor, exposing raw nerves to the world. But in vulnerability, Daniel found strength and a surprising sense of connection. Meanwhile, Naomi continued pushing the boundaries of justice. She fought tirelessly in courtrooms, in city halls, and on street corners, championing reforms that addressed not just the symptoms, but the roots of systemic abuse. Her work was fueled by the stories of people like Jameer, Malik, and even Daniel, a man who'd once been her adversary but had now become a symbol of possibility. Their paths crossed often, their conversations evolving beyond legal strategies into something deeper, shared hopes, fears, and the complex dance between justice and redemption. Naomi knew the road ahead was long, littered with obstacles that couldn't be overcome overnight. But she also knew that change began when people dared to face the uncomfortable truths hiding in plain sight. One afternoon, Daniel stood before a group of teenagers at a community center. The room was charged with energy, some faces curious, others skeptical. He spoke candidly about his journey, the choices he'd made, the pain he'd caused, and the ongoing work to make things right. He didn't seek forgiveness. He sought understanding, and perhaps a chance to inspire others to choose differently. As he spoke, Daniel noticed the shift, the walls coming down, even if just a little. Questions were asked, doubts voiced, and for the first time, real dialogue took place. It was messy, imperfect, but genuine. Outside, the city thrummed with life, chaotic, unpredictable, and beautiful in its resilience. Daniel knew his story was just one thread in a vast tapestry of struggle and hope. But it was enough to start weaving a new narrative, one where the badge no longer served as armor, but as a symbol of accountability and change. The seasons shifted, and with them, the city's pulse continued its restless rhythm. Daniel found himself learning new lessons every day, some harsh, others quietly profound. The world outside remained skeptical, but within the cracks of that skepticism, moments of grace began to emerge. He wasn't just a disgraced officer anymore. He was a man wrestling with his past and striving for something better. One afternoon, Daniel was invited to speak at a local university, a place filled with young minds hungry for truth and justice. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation as he took the stage, feeling the weight of thousands of eyes on him. He didn't flinch. Instead, he shared his story, unfiltered, raw, and painfully honest. He talked about the badge he once wore like armor, the mistakes he made, and the journey toward accountability. Questions flooded in afterward. Some students were angry, others curious. A few thanked him for his courage. Daniel realized this was more than a speech. It was a conversation, a bridge spanning generations and experiences. And in that exchange, he found hope. Meanwhile, Naomi's work expanded beyond courtrooms. She collaborated with activists, educators, and policymakers to create programs aimed at rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. She believed that true justice required systemic change, but also healing on a personal level. Her partnership with Daniel, though unlikely to some, became a beacon of that belief. One evening, as Daniel walked through a neighborhood park, he encountered a mural painted on a brick wall, vibrant colors depicting hands reaching out, a broken badge transforming into a dove. It was a symbol of redemption and peace. For the first time, Daniel felt that maybe, just maybe, his story was part of something bigger than his own pain. He knew the journey ahead was far from over. There would be setbacks, criticisms, and moments of doubt. But he also knew that vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was the bravest armor he could wear. And so, beneath the shifting skies, Daniel stepped forward, not as a man hiding behind a badge, but as one standing boldly in the light of his own truth. In the weeks that followed his university talk, Daniel's presence in the community became more frequent and visible. He volunteered at local shelters, participated in town hall meetings, and even helped organize neighborhood patrols. Not with a badge or gun, but as a civilian committed to change. Each day was a battle to rebuild trust, a task more daunting than any he'd faced in uniform. The reactions were mixed. Some welcomed his efforts, seeing them as genuine steps toward healing. Others remained skeptical, haunted by memories of abuse and betrayal. Daniel accepted their doubt. He didn't expect forgiveness to come easily. Instead, he focused on consistency, showing up even when it was hard, speaking honestly when it was easier to stay silent. Naomi continued to be both a partner and a challenger. Their relationship was complex, forged in the crucible of justice and tempered by shared humanity. They debated policy, strategized community outreach, and confronted uncomfortable truths about the system they were trying to change. Yet beneath it all lay mutual respect, and a growing understanding that redemption was possible, even for those who'd fallen the hardest. One day, Daniel received a letter from Jameer, the young man whose testimony had helped bring him to justice. Jameer wrote about his own struggles, the scars he carried, and his hopes for a future free from fear and violence. He thanked Daniel not for the past, but for the present, recognizing the hard work of change and accountability. The letter moved Daniel deeply. It was a reminder that beyond courtroom battles and public opinion, for Daniel, the journey was just beginning. The loss wasn't just his job or his reputation. It was the loss of the self he'd constructed piece by piece, the man who believed that wearing the badge meant he was untouchable, unbreakable. But the truth had a way of finding cracks in the strongest armor, and once it did, everything else came rushing in. That night, alone in a small, dimly lit apartment, Daniel stared at the faded photo on his dresser. A picture of a younger version of himself, unburdened, hopeful. The man he used to be, before the weight of the badge became too much. Tears came slow at first, then faster. Not just for himself, but for the people he'd hurt. For the promises he'd broken. For the silence he'd maintained. Naomi, meanwhile, stayed late at her office, going over notes and testimonies. The courtroom was only one battlefront. The deeper war was against the culture that allowed officers to hide behind power and escape accountability. She thought about Malik, Jameer, Lana, faces that would stay with her forever. Their voices were now part of a chorus demanding change. Outside, the rain fell softly, washing the city clean. It was a new day, but the shadows lingered. Daniel knew redemption wouldn't come easy, if at all. But maybe, just maybe, the armor could finally come off, and with it, the chance to be something better. The days after the verdict felt like a blur for Daniel. The public, hungry for a headline, devoured every detail of his fall from grace. News cameras flashed outside his small apartment. Neighbors whispered in hallways. His once loyal colleagues kept their distance, exchanging glances that said more than words ever could. The badge, which had once been his crown, was now a brand that burned his reputation to ashes. Daniel's mind replayed every moment of the trial. The courtroom, the testimonies, the accusing eyes of the jury. But more than that, he thought about Naomi, the woman who had torn his armor off in court with nothing but truth and relentless willpower. There was no hatred in her, no desire to destroy him personally. What drove her was justice, pure and unfiltered. He wrestled with a complex blend of anger, regret, and shame. How had he let it get this far? How did a man who wanted to protect end up inflicting so much pain? His fingers traced the scar on his wrist, a mark from years ago, from a moment when his own vulnerability was exposed and punished. That scar was a reminder of the lessons he learned early. Strength meant survival, and survival meant never showing weakness. But what he hadn't realized was that strength could also mean facing the truth, no matter how painful. Meanwhile, Naomi moved through her days with a new weight on her shoulders. She knew her work was far from done. Daniel's conviction was a landmark, yes, but the system that nurtured his abuse remained entrenched. Officers who crossed lines were rarely held accountable. Victims were still silenced. And the badge, the symbol of authority, was still wielded like a weapon in many hands. Naomi began reaching out to community leaders, organizing forums to give voice to those too scared to speak. She mentored young lawyers, urging them to take on the system. Each victory, no matter how small, was a light against the darkness. One evening, Daniel found himself walking the streets of the neighborhood he once patrolled with pride. The faces he passed no longer looked at him with respect or fear, just wary distance. Children played on cracked sidewalks, families gathered on stoops, and the weight of history hung heavy in the air. He remembered how many times he'd driven through these streets, thinking he was the line between order and chaos. Now, he saw the fractures his own hands had helped create. The path ahead was uncertain. Daniel knew redemption was not guaranteed. It was something he had to earn every day. He decided to reach out quietly to some of the people he had wronged. Apologies wouldn't erase the past, but they might be a start. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the rubble of his former self, a flicker of hope remained. Maybe armor wasn't just protection from pain. Maybe, if he could learn to take it off, he could finally start healing and help others do the same. The weeks that followed brought a slow but profound change in Daniel. Stripped of his badge and the power it carried, He faced a new kind of battle, one fought not in courtrooms or city streets, but within himself. The armor he once wore to keep the world out was gone, leaving him raw and exposed to memories he'd long ignored. Each day brought fresh waves of remorse and a gnawing desire to make amends. Daniel started attending community meetings, not as an officer, but as a man seeking forgiveness. At first, the room was thick with tension. Faces that had once feared or resented him watched silently, unsure what to make of this former enforcer showing vulnerability. But he spoke honestly, sharing his story not to justify his past, but to own it. He admitted his failures, his blindness, and the damage he'd caused. It wasn't easy. Some left in anger. Others stayed and listened. Over time, walls began to crumble, replaced by cautious understanding. One afternoon, an elderly woman approached him after a meeting, tears in her eyes. "It takes real courage to stand here and say what you just said," she said. "Maybe this is the first step toward something better." Meanwhile, Naomi continued her crusade. She had become a beacon for those who felt voiceless, dedicating herself to systemic reform. But she also recognized that true change required more than policy. It demanded empathy and the willingness of individuals like Daniel to confront their own darkness. One day, Naomi received a letter. It was from Daniel. He wrote about the journey he was on, the weight of guilt, and a sincere desire to help rebuild the trust he'd broken. It wasn't an excuse or a plea for forgiveness. It was a commitment. Naomi met him in a quiet cafe. Their conversation was tentative but sincere. They spoke about justice not just as a legal concept but as a human one, about accountability, healing, and the complex layers that bind us all. In that meeting, something shifted. Not a neat resolution, but a fragile bridge, built on honesty and a shared hope that even the deepest wounds might someday mend. Outside, the city pulsed with life. The badge Daniel once wore had lost its shine, but the man beneath it was beginning to discover a new kind of strength. One born not from armor, but from vulnerability. The city never slept, and neither did Daniel's thoughts. Each night, the memories replayed like an unrelenting film. Flashes of moments when his badge had shielded him, when his silence had broken others, when the line between protector and oppressor blurred beyond recognition. He grappled with the weight of those memories, but also with the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, he could forge a new path. Daniel's days became a mosaic of small steps. He volunteered at local outreach programs, lending his time to help the very communities he'd once overlooked. It wasn't easy. Faces still bore traces of distrust, and some whispered about him behind closed doors. But he didn't expect forgiveness overnight. Healing, he realized, was a marathon, not a sprint. Naomi watched these changes with cautious optimism. She wasn't naive. She knew one man's transformation didn't fix a broken system. Yet Daniel's willingness to confront his past gave her hope that change could ripple outward. They began collaborating on community panels and workshops. Real people lived with the consequences of his actions, and that healing required more than words. It demanded empathy, humility, and relentless effort. Daniel began facilitating support groups for victims of police abuse, offering a space where stories could be shared and voices heard. He listened more than he spoke, learning lessons that no badge could teach. The process was painful but necessary, a pathway toward collective healing. At the same time, Naomi spearheaded legislation aimed at increasing transparency and accountability within the police force. Their joint efforts, though often met with resistance, started to ripple through the community, inspiring others to demand justice and reform. Despite setbacks, Daniel found a new purpose, not as a man defined by his past, but as one striving to rewrite the future. He no longer wore the badge as armor. Instead, he carried the weight of truth with courage and grace. The air in the community center was thick with emotion as Daniel stepped onto the small stage once again. This time, he wasn't there as a defendant or a former officer, but as a messenger, someone who had walked through fire and come out with a story that needed to be heard. The room was packed with faces young and old, some skeptical, others hopeful, all searching for answers. He began quietly, recounting the early days of his career, the pride he felt slipping on his uniform, the weight of responsibility resting heavy on his shoulders. But then, with a steady voice, he peeled back the layers to reveal the man beneath the badge. A boy shaped by silence, fear, and unspoken pain. The armor he once wore had protected him from vulnerability, but it had also blinded him to the humanity of those he was sworn to serve. Daniel told them about the trial, the testimony, and the moment when everything he believed about himself shattered. He spoke of Naomi, the relentless defender who refused to let the truth stay buried, and of Jameer, the young man whose courage forced him to face the consequences of his actions. As he spoke, the room was silent, absorbing every word, every pause. Afterward, hands raised with questions, some challenging, others seeking guidance. Daniel answered honestly, never shying away from his mistakes or the ongoing struggle for redemption. Later that evening, a young woman approached him. She shared her own story of loss and fear at the hands of law enforcement, thanking Daniel for his openness. Their conversation was raw and real, a testament to the fragile bridges being built on the foundation of truth. Outside, the city lights flickered, a reminder that the work was far from over. But for Daniel, each story, each connection was a step toward healing. Not just for himself, but for the community he once failed. The badge was gone, the armor shattered. What remained was a man learning to live without it, imperfect, vulnerable, but determined. Daniel sat alone in the quiet of his apartment, the low hum of the city outside barely reaching his ears. The trial was over, the verdict delivered, and yet the weight of it all hadn't lifted. The badge he once wore like armor was now just a relic, a reminder of a life he could never return to. But what came next? The path of redemption, accountability, and healing was far more complex and daunting than he'd imagined. His journey wasn't just about facing the community or his victims. It was about confronting the darkest parts of himself. The rage, the denial, the brokenness he'd hidden beneath years of authority. He thought often about the little boy he'd been, the silent witness to violence and neglect, and how those wounds had shaped the man he became. One evening, as rain pattered softly against the window, Daniel picked up a worn journal. Page after page held reflections, regrets, and tentative hopes. Writing had become a lifeline, a way to wrestle with guilt and chart a course forward. He wrote about Naomi, how her relentless pursuit of truth had forced him to reckon with himself. He wrote about Jameer and Malik, faces that haunted his conscience and reminded him why change mattered. The next day, Daniel visited a community center to speak at a support group for victims of police misconduct. The room was filled with wary eyes and guarded hearts. As he shared his story, there were moments of tension, silence, and even anger. But there was also something else, an opening. A fragile space where dialogue could begin, where wounds could start to heal. Outside the center, Daniel met with Naomi. They discussed their work, the battles ahead, and the slow, painful process of transforming a broken system. Their partnership, born of conflict, had evolved into something rooted in respect and a shared vision of justice. But the path wasn't linear. Daniel faced backlash from former colleagues who saw his actions as betrayal. He received threatening messages and experienced moments of isolation. Yet, each challenge strengthened his resolve. In quiet moments, he reflected on the meaning of the badge. Once a symbol of power and protection, now a lesson in humility and responsibility. He understood that true strength came not from armor, but from vulnerability and the courage to change. As the city pulsed around him, Daniel Cross was no longer the untouchable officer he once pretended to be. He was a man stripped bare, striving to make amends, and searching for redemption in a world that demanded more than just justice. It demanded humanity. Months had passed since the trial, and Daniel's world had transformed in ways he never imagined possible. The badge he once wore like armor was long gone, but the scars, both visible and invisible, remained. Yet with each passing day, Daniel felt the heavy weight on his shoulders ease just a little, replaced by a newfound purpose that transcended the uniform he had lost. The community's eyes remained watchful. Trust, once shattered, could not be rebuilt overnight. Some still saw him as the man who betrayed his oath. Others recognized the effort he was making to atone. And amidst this fractured landscape, Daniel found himself caught between condemnation and cautious hope. His relationship with Naomi had deepened, not just as allies in justice, but as two people bound by the complex dance of accountability and forgiveness. Their conversations grew more personal, exploring not only legal reforms but the human cost behind headlines and court cases. Together, they began planning a foundation dedicated to helping victims of police abuse and supporting officers seeking reform from within. One crisp autumn afternoon, Daniel stood before a crowd at the very community center where he'd first spoken after his fall from grace. His voice was steady, but the words carried the weight of years, the mistakes, the remorse, the slow journey toward healing. He spoke not as a man seeking redemption but as one committed to it, acknowledging that the path was lifelong. Among the listeners were faces he once saw only in fear or anger. Families, activists, former adversaries, each holding pieces of a fractured community yearning for change. For the first time, Daniel felt the possibility of unity, not a naive dream, but a fragile, hard-earned reality. Later, as the event ended and people mingled, a young woman approached him. Her eyes were bright, filled with determination. "Thank you for being honest," she said quietly. "It gives me hope that things can really change." Daniel smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. It was a moment of grace, proof that even the darkest armor could be torn away to reveal something stronger underneath. As dusk settled over the city, Daniel walked home alone, the cool air brushing against his face. He no longer feared the weight of his past. Instead, he embraced it as part of the man he was becoming. The badge had failed him, but the truth had set him free. And in that freedom, he found his true armor: vulnerability, accountability, and the courage to keep moving forward. The city had a rhythm all its own, a mix of hope, tension, and hard-won resilience. For Daniel, each day was a step further away from the man who once believed his badge made him invincible. The armor was gone, but the lessons it left behind shaped every choice he made now. His partnership with Naomi had blossomed into a powerful force for change. Together, they launched the foundation they had dreamed of, a place dedicated to healing, education, and reform. The center offered legal aid to victims, counseling to families, and workshops for officers willing to confront the dark corners of their profession. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was a start, a beacon in a landscape too often marked by silence and suffering. Daniel found purpose in this work, but the ghosts of his past never fully faded. Some nights, he'd lie awake haunted by the sound of Jameer's head hitting the hood, by the eyes of those he'd betrayed. Guilt was a heavy companion, but he learned to carry it not as a burden, but as a reminder of why his work mattered. One afternoon, the foundation hosted a community forum. People shared stories, grief, hope, and sometimes anger. Daniel listened, feeling the weight and beauty of those voices, the collective pulse of a community demanding justice. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't mince words. He owned his failures, the harm done, and the long road ahead. A young man stood up afterward, his voice steady but raw. "How do you keep going when the past feels like it's always there, pulling you down?" he asked. Daniel smiled softly, his eyes steady. "You keep going because giving up means letting the past win. Because the people we hurt deserve better. Because hope isn't about forgetting. It's about fighting to do better, every single day." Naomi watched from the sidelines, pride and respect mingling in her gaze. Their journey wasn't about heroes or villains. It was about human beings, flawed and striving. And in that messy, imperfect space, real change took root. Weeks later, Daniel stood quietly at Jameer's side during a community memorial. The young man's journey from victim to advocate had inspired many. Their stories, intertwined by pain and redemption, became a testament to the power of truth. As the sun set, Daniel looked out over the city skyline, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The badge had once defined him, but it no longer controlled him. His true strength came from the courage to face himself, to tear off the armor, and to walk into the light of accountability. The road ahead was long and uncertain. But for the first time, Daniel Cross was ready, not as a man hiding behind a badge, but as one embracing the raw, difficult, and beautiful journey toward redemption. The foundation's walls echoed with stories, some heartbreaking, others filled with courage. Daniel often found himself sitting quietly in those rooms, listening more than speaking. He'd learned that true change wasn't about grand speeches or courtroom victories, but about the small moments. A tear shed, a handshake offered, a story finally told. One afternoon, Naomi invited Daniel to join a panel of community leaders discussing the next phase of reform. The room was packed with activists, officials, and residents, each bringing their own experiences and visions. Daniel felt the familiar knot of nerves, but it was different now. Less about proving himself, more about sharing the hard truths. He spoke about the armor he once wore, how it protected and imprisoned him at the same time. About the people he hurt and those who helped him see the light. And about the promise he made to himself every day, to be better, to listen, to act with humility. Questions came fast, sharp, and sometimes skeptical. But Daniel met each one with honesty. The dialogue wasn't always comfortable, but it was real, and real was what they all needed. Afterward, as the room cleared, a young woman approached Daniel. She thanked him for his vulnerability and shared her story of surviving police violence. They talked long after the event ended, two imperfect souls finding common ground in pain and hope. That night, Daniel walked home under a sky full of stars. The journey had been long, marked by loss and reckoning. But as he looked up, he felt something he hadn't in years: peace. Not because the past was erased, but because he'd finally made peace with it. The badge had been torn off in court, but it was the tearing down of his own defenses that truly set him free. His armor had been replaced not by invincibility, but by courage, the courage to face himself, to stand accountable, and to keep walking toward a better tomorrow. The road to redemption isn't a straight line. It's a winding path filled with stumbles, setbacks, and hard truths. Daniel Cross knew this better than anyone. The badge he once wore like armor was gone, torn off not just by a courtroom verdict, but by the relentless pursuit of justice and the courage of a woman who refused to back down. His story had become more than just a personal journey. It was a mirror reflecting the fractures in a system that too often shielded the powerful and silenced the vulnerable. But within that broken system there was hope. Hope born from accountability, vulnerability, and the willingness to change. Daniel stood now not as a man hiding behind a symbol, but as someone embracing the raw, difficult process of healing. He'd faced his past, owned his mistakes, and worked tirelessly to help others find their voices and reclaim their dignity. Naomi's role in this story was undeniable. A fierce advocate who tore down walls of denial and brought light to hidden truths. Together, they had sparked conversations, inspired reforms, and planted seeds of change in a community long starved for justice. As the story closes, the real work begins. Change requires more than stories. It demands action. It requires each of us to look beyond the surface, to challenge our assumptions, and to stand up for those whose voices are too often drowned out. If this story moved you, if it challenged your perspective, or if it sparked a desire for justice in your heart, share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of Daniel and Naomi's journey resonated with you? How do you think we can all play a role in tearing down the armor that hides injustice? Your voice matters. Together, we can keep the conversation alive and work toward a world where badges are symbols of true protection, not armor for abuse. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that dive deep into the fight for justice and humanity.